So good morning. I'm Elfia, and I will be presenting our study, which consists in an empirical evaluation of simple reinstatement. It's a study that was done based on a study by Rahwan from 2010, which has become again somewhat relevant to the current discourse of argumentation. So let me jump right in and familiarize you with the study in case you are not familiar with it. So Rahwan tried to empirically evaluate some of the abstract argumentation schemes by Jung. Specifically, we focused on simple reinstatement. They did some variations of it as well. Basically, the kind of reinstatement that they looked at was can be represented by this graph where the nodes are the arguments and the arrows are the attacks. So basically what this reinstatement scheme that they looked at is you have argument A, and then an attacker is introduced, argument B, and then a counter attacker, an attacker of the attacker B is introduced. So A in this sense is reinstated by C, and then both A and C would be skeptically acceptable. So how they did that is that they presented those three arguments sequentially to the participants. The first stage consisted in participants being presented only with argument A. Then they evaluated the conclusion of argument A. Then argument B was introduced, and again they evaluated the conclusion of argument A. And then when it was reinstated, again they evaluated the conclusion of argument A. So one would expect when an attacker is introduced, the confidence rating of the conclusion of argument A to drop and then to increase again when C is presented. And what they found was that happens, but partially. So yes, the confidence rating at the third stage does increase again when C is introduced, but it does not fully recover. So the confidence ratings were significantly lower in this reinstated stage. And they gave an explanation in terms of suspension of participants' disbelief, which I will be elaborating on in a moment. First, let me go through the motivation of our study. Well, first, we tried to replicate Rahwan's results, as we believe that replicability is a very significant matter. Actually, it's one of the cornerstones of the scientific method, and we see in social psychology an existing replicability crisis. Moreover, the reason we chose particularly this study is that, as I say, it has become again somewhat central in the current discourse, as it's being used as evidence to support the gradual notions of argument acceptability. Either that having fewer attackers is better, or that having no attackers is more acceptable than having attackers, even those are counterattacks. So we will be investigating this. And thirdly, we wanted to look at the more general concept of using descriptive experimental design empirical experiments in order to conclude for normative theories, as we believe that this is not yet clear how it can be relevant and why. So what we did, we conducted 3 separate experiments to rule out 2 alternative explanations. So basically what this means is that if we want to consider the findings of imperfect recovery as supporting evidence for the gradual acceptability, then that means that participants somehow have in mind this principle of gradual semantics in their head. However, we believe that these results of imperfect recovery can be are due to different explanations that I will be elaborating on the next slide. And that's what we purported to investigate by altering the manner of arguments presentations. And very briefly, some info about our experiments. We had 390 participants, where each participant evaluated the conclusion of argument A in 4 different argument sets on a 7-point scale. So our first experiment was the one that purported to replicate Rahwan's study. So what we expected to find from this was, again, the imperfect reinstatement. So ratings that were given at the reinstated stage to be lower than the ones at the base stage. So let me make this more visually understandable. What the first group was presented with was first argument A, and then the 7-point scale, and they would have to evaluate the conclusion. Then sequentially we're presented with the next argument, meaning then B was introduced, and then again they would have to evaluate the conclusion, and then C, here as like in C as like in the terms of B, B as like in the terms of A, they would have again to evaluate. And we would expect ratings at this stage to be lower than this stage. Now for a second group, or second experiment, we purported to investigate the first explanation, the one that the study of Rahwan gives, which is in terms of suspension of disbelief. So what they claim is that participants have all sorts of objections and disbeliefs, their own disbeliefs about the arguments that they are presented with. So when they enter, when they start an experiment, for the sake of this experiment, they just choose to suspend these. But then once an experimenter starts bringing in the counter argument, then this breaks the suspension, and that's what leads them for their own disbeliefs to come into play, and then that's what leads to the recovery never being perfect again. So to test this, we said, okay, we will present all arguments at once, and we will eliminate this gradual element. So if indeed initially participants are inclined to suspend their own disbeliefs, but it's in a later inter step that they choose to drop this, well, then we will not have this intermediate step. We will present all at once at the beginning. So all arguments will be initially presented, and they will all fall under this suspension of disbelief. So we would expect here the ratings that are given for this group to be higher from the ratings at the reinstated stage. For group 2 now, this is what it looked like. They were only presented with one slide. So basically they gave one rating per argument set. And then the third one, the third experiment, is investigated a variation of this explanation by Prakken and Winter, which actually suggests that, it's not exactly that they suspended disbelief, but once they are actually presented with a counter argument, then they think of all the other possible attackers of an argument, which are not then explicitly counterattacked as the one that is explicitly presented. So to do that, we introduced a relevant theory prior to the evaluations. So here we have these generalized sentences of the arguments that are later used. They first read it, and then this way they're somewhat presented with all the possible things that might happen in the evaluation, all the possible counter arguments. So that would lead them not to be surprised when a counterattacker comes, and then there would be no sense in the confidence in other attackers increasing. So we would expect that by the end, the reinstated stage in this case would be higher than in group 1. And also we kind of expect that the base stage would be a bit lower because now they are aware of an attacker from the beginning. So yes, they're first presented with the relevant theory. And then again, like in experiment 1, they give their evaluations sequentially 3 times in this experiment as well. So to summarize our hypotheses, we compare the ratings of the participants for the conclusion of argument A. So the confirmation of the first hypothesis would give the successful replication of Rahwan's study, and the rest of the hypotheses, if confirmed, they underline the importance of the way in which subjects are presented with arguments. So that would mean that the possible effects of suspension of disbelief can be valid explanations, and findings cannot be considered as supporting evidence for grading notions of argument acceptability. So, what happened? These are the results of the first and second experiment. Here in the bold black, it's our first one, where reinstated stage is significantly lower than the base stage. So yes, the replication is successful. Imperfect recovery was found here as well. And if you look at Rahwan's study, which is the one with the circles, our results, especially in the reinstated stage, were pretty close. But here as well, the error bars overlap, giving us a very good replication case. But unfortunately, our second hypothesis, the one about the destruction of disbelief, the explanation that Rahwan provides, cannot be confirmed here. We see that there is no significant difference between the ratings that participants gave for the conclusion of argument A when all arguments were presented versus when we did it the way Rahwan did. If we'll move on to our third experiment, here we have one confirmation and one rejection. So we would, I would say, we expect here the ratings in the reinstated stage to be higher in group 3, and they are. However, they are also surprisingly higher in the base stage as well. So 3A is confirmed, but 3B is not. And basically, this interaction effect that we expected is not here. So basically, what we would expect is, as experiment 3 would be lower in the base stage and higher in the reinstated, its graph would look like a horizontal line, kind of parallel to the x-axis, because we were expecting no imperfect recovery. Instead, what we see here is parallel lines. So one, what we can deduct from this is that there is a similar drop in both experiments. Here, we also see that there is a significant difference between the 2 stages. So we find the imperfect recovery in the third experiment as well. And moreover, what we can observe is that experiment 3 ratings are overall higher. So the experiment does have a significant effect. Introducing the relevant theory prior to the evaluation does have a significant effect, but not exactly the way we expected. So if we are to revisit our hypotheses now, 2 of them are confirmed. So yes, we found the imperfect restatement of the first group. And yes, the reinstated stage of the third group was higher. However, the rest of them are rejected. Now, what does this mean? As we said, for the first experiment, it's straightforward. The replication is successful. When it comes to the second one, well, unfortunately, these results cannot really endorse the explanation that Rahwan gives for suspension of disbelief, as we found no difference when we eliminated this gradual component. And as for the third experiment, actually, here we have confirmation of one hypothesis, but also the rejection of the other. And we do not have this interaction effect that we predicted that the confirmation of both of them would entail. Also, if we think that we all found imperfect restatement, so this introduction of the relevant theory didn't really manage to eliminate the imperfect restatement in the third experiment, then we can conclude that the variation suggested by Prakken in the mid cannot really be endorsed by these results as well. So before I come back to our research question about whether these results can indeed be used as evidence in favor of gradual notions of acceptability, let's look at some other issues that arise from these experiments. So first, let's consider the arguments that we really compared. Both our study and Rahwan's study looked at a very specific case of an unattacked argument and then a reinstated one. So we're talking about a special case of the void precedence here. We did not check for further attackers. And moreover, we also compared these two arguments, let's say, when they were the same. So we compared A unattacked and then A reinstated. But we need still to check whether they can generalize when these two arguments are different. So that's one thing that remains to be done. But even if it does get done, not all alternative explanations are ruled out. So I began by saying that we need, and we investigated alternative explanations because we need to rule them out in order to gain the discriminatory power of our findings in favor of graduality. However, here there is an alternative explanation that is also mentioned by Prakken and De Winter, where it's about the directionality of the attacks. So we talked about how these argument sets can be depicted by this graph, where A would be skeptically acceptable. But actually, it's much more probable that humans actually perceive these sets as this scheme, basically. So yes, B does attack the premise of argument A, but then argument A also attacks B. So it is very probable that human participants did not interpret these attacks as asymmetrical rather than symmetrical. And then A would only be credulously accepted. That is in fact something that Kramer and Guillaume have individually empirically confirmed, that humans do perceive the undermining as bidirectional as they are in aspect class. So can these findings be used in favor of graduality? Well, firstly, one needs still to prove that they can generalize to other patterns. However, even if that is done, one needs to be sure that all alternative explanations are ruled out, because if you have various explanations, possible explanations for the same subject, then you cannot really be sure which one your findings are actually endorsing. However, there is a third hurdle here, even if somebody does manage to eliminate all alternative explanations. And that is, what is the role actually of such empirical studies? So we find that it's not immediately obvious how such findings on how people actually argue can be relevant for a normative theory, which is about how people should argue. So yes, there are some benefits from empirical findings. So we propose that they can be beneficial in making normative theories more cognitively plausible, for instance. But that does not mean that they cannot deviate those norms, those theories, from how people actually reason. Sorry. Yes. So these empirical researches, they can tell us how people tend to assess things. For instance, here, yes, maybe people tend to assess arguments in gradual terms, but how do we interpret these? Maybe that means we need to develop normative theories of gradual argument evaluation, but that does not mean that they should follow exactly our empirical results. So the specific design of such theories needs also to be based on philosophical insight. So to conclude, firstly, we did manage to successfully replicate the findings of Rahwan on imperfect restatement. We then tried to investigate two possible explanations, the one presented by Rahwan and a variant proposed by Prakken and the Winters. However, our findings cannot endorse either of these explanations. However, there are yet alternative explanations to be ruled out. So our findings at best could support a special case of the borrowed presence, as we said, but not yet. Moreover, this alternative explanation that I talked about, the directionality, gives rise to a more general issue, which is the formalization of natural language and the gap between how humans interpret the things presented to them and what experimenters intended to do. And finally, we'd like to suggest for future research to focus on the main hurdles I talked about on the previous slide, and specifically the third one, which is the most difficult one in our view, which is about the empirical findings. So we do not question the importance of graduality in argumentation in general. We just want to see how it is better modeled and how we can use these empirical findings. We think that there needs to be a more systematic manner of their use. And we don't believe that they can be used as direct evidence for the validity of reasoning patterns, but rather they can help us to make normative theories more applicable by humans. Thank you.